Hello, true crimerers. This is going to be another compilation video. These don't take much effort at all to put together, so I can throw these at you every once in a while still. So these are videos from over on my TikTok page. So yes, it's going to be in the TikTok format. Some people don't mind, some people hate it. Sorry, but that's what it is. The particular theme of this compilation is mass killings. So these are stories where someone or someone's ended the lives of many people in one story, one situation. Yeah. There is 20 stories in this one. One of them is going to be a little odd because it's the story of John List, a very well-known story in the true crime world, but it's a two-parter for TikTok. It was before I had access to 10-minute videos. It's one I just had gotten 3-minute videos available. So it was a while ago, but so there'll be a weird this is part 2. Sorry about that, but it is what it is. So without further ado, here are 20 cases of mass killings. Viewer discretion is advised. Jingle, jingle, says the dog. "51 people would be killed in just a matter of 15 minutes. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Christchurch Mosque shootings. Viewer discretion is advised. This is the Al-Nur Mosque, and it is located in Christchurch, New Zealand. On March 15th, 2019, at approximately 1:40 p.m., with 190 people inside, a far-right extremist and white supremacist 28-year-old Brenton Tarrant, he would activate his GoPro, armed with a semi-automatic shotgun and an AR-15 rifle. He would approach the mosque and a worshiper came out to greet him. He said, "Hello, brother." Brenton, while live streaming this on Facebook, shot the worshiper. Just flat out killed him. He then walked into the entrance where he shot and killed 3 more people. He then went into the prayer hall where most of the people were, and he would just shoot everywhere. He even used a strobe light attached to his gun to disorient people, and that worked. He then went back outside, went to his car, killed the person who was walking by, began to shoot people in the parking lot, then went back into the mosque, and then he began to shoot people who were injured but were still alive, effectively killing them. Police are obviously called, but he gets into his car and speeds off. The first attack happened in about 10 minutes, and he live streamed the entire thing. Police just missed him. At 1:52 p.m., he would arrive at the Linwood Islamic Center. There were 100 people inside there. He began opening fire on the building and the windows, shooting people from outside. He managed to get out of his car, then go inside where he shot and killed 3 more people. He killed 7 people at the Linwood Center and injured about 5 more. At the Al-Nur Mosque, he killed 44 people and injured 35 more. The youngest victim was 3 years old. 3. What kind of monster does any of this? By 1:55 p.m., the shooter was finally arrested, leaving 51 bodies in his wake. He had a manifesto, because they always do. It was called The Great Replacement. In it, he stated how much he hated migrants, non-Europeans need to be removed, and he was anti-Muslim. I'll never understand. He pled guilty to 51 murders. He got life without parole. Lucky him. The United States holds the distinction of being where most school shootings occur. Almost at a point where we can just say, well, it is a Tuesday. But when they happen elsewhere in the world, it rocks the entire nation to its core. and action is actually taken. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Dunbar Massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. This was 43-year-old Thomas Hamilton. He was born in 1952 in Glasgow, Scotland. In his adult years, Thomas would run some youth clubs. This is an image of him at one of those clubs. He got a lot of complaints for being very inappropriate towards the younger boys. There were claims that he took inappropriate photos of boys. At one point, he was a Boy Scout leader where he would have the boys sleep very close to him at night. He was a walking red flag. He would have his Boy Scout warrant taken away from him. He would become blacklisted. And this was all by the end of 1974. In 1993, he actually tried to open up his own boys' club, but he was publicly persecuted for even trying it. This is Dunbar Primary School, which is located in the area of Stirling, Scotland. On the 13th of March 1996 at approximately 9:30 a.m., Thomas would park his white van just outside the school, armed with 4 handguns. He then cut the phone lines to the houses around the school. He walked inside the gymnasium where 28 children were, and 3 teachers were also in there. He lifted his gun and began to fire. He shot wildly and randomly in every single direction. One of the teachers was injured when she was shot, and she was able to crawl to a nearby cupboard where she directed students to go hide with her. Thomas just kept firing. During all of this, he hit several children, incapacitating many of them. He then walked up to those children who were on the ground, and he fired at them at point-blank range. Without any feeling, no emotion, one by one, he shot and killed 17 children and 1 teacher. He then placed one of the guns in his own mouth and pulled the trigger, ending his own life. Why did he choose this school? That was never known. What was the motive? Maybe angry about the past with the Boy Scouts? Who knows? The coward ended his own life, so we never get to know. He also injured 15 more students and teachers. Because of this, by 1997, Scotland banned all cartridge ammunition handguns. Gee, it's almost as if they care. G'day, true crimeers. This is the case known as the Toowoomba triple homicide. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes us to the city of Toowoomba, which is located in Australia. On the evening of May 30th, 2005, here at this house, there was a little shindig, a little party going on. It was the home of a man, 30-year-old Michael Thompson. Also there that night was 17-year-old David Lyons and 17-year-old Ty Wilson, amongst other partygoers and guests. Apparently at this party, things got a little out of hand. Now, Michael Thompson opened up his home a few weeks prior to this to a few teenagers who needed a roof over their head. 2 of them are pictured here. The third one has not been revealed because of minor safety laws. You have Scott Magar, who was 18 years old at the time, and then John Whitman, who was 16 years old at the time. Well, for motives still unknown, these men, including the third unidentified teenager, were involved in sexually assaulting a woman while her 22-month-old son was just nearby. And then, after an altercation took place, they bludgeoned all 3 of these men to death. Again, for reasons unknown, or at least not that's been publicized. And then they fled the house. And then police got there and began their investigation. It was a pretty gruesome crime scene, according to police officers. They particularly noted the savage nature of the attacks and the blatant disregard for just anyone else that was there. Well, thankfully witnesses were present, so the 3 teenagers were caught very quickly. Now, here's where it gets kind of tricky. You see, Scott Magar, he was named right away because he was 18. John Whitman went through his entire trial without ever being named publicly because he was 16 years old at the time of the murders. The other boy, who was also 16, he also went unnamed. So these 2 were convicted and sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole after 15 years and 20 years respectively. In 2007, John Whitman's name was released, so he was named and then shamed. Good. For some reason, the third teenager, legally speaking, still cannot be named, and he was released from prison. He only got a 10-year sentence. This was because his involvement was these two actually stabbed him as well and beat him over the head, and then they forced him to kill the third victim. So while he was a victim, he also committed a murder technically. Perhaps that's why his name can't be released, because he was also a victim. I don't know. The triple homicide is considered one of Toowoomba's worst murder cases. He will likely be in prison forever because he also murdered an inmate. Boy's got problems. A happy Aurora, Colorado family was celebrating a birthday behind the doors of this home, but that would end in an unimaginable nightmare. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Bennett family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. On January 15th, 1984, in Aurora, Colorado, the Bennett family was celebrating Melissa's 7th birthday. After a fun night of opening presents, eating cake and ice cream, the family would go to bed. Sometime during the night, Bruce would jump out of bed because he heard a noise. The noise was from an intruder. An unknown assailant entered the home for whatever reasons, and the 28-year-old father of two would go toe-to-toe with the intruder. Bruce Bennett was trying to protect his family. Unfortunately, Bruce would lose the fight. He was stabbed and then beaten to death with a hammer. He had defensive wounds all over his hands, so he put up a good fight. The intruder then went into the master bedroom, where he came across 26-year-old Deborah. He slashed her with a knife, and then he sexually assaulted her, and then beat her to death with a hammer. And then he found 7-year-old Melissa. Everything that he did to Deborah, he also did to her. But he wasn't done. He then found 3-year-old Vanessa. He struck her over the head with the hammer. It actually shattered her entire jawbone, which broke the bones into tiny pieces that went down her throat, and then her windpipe was also punctured. He continued to hit her, but guess what? She survived. This is her now. She was the only survivor of the Bennett family murders. The next morning, the grandmother would find the dead bodies. Police obviously investigated. They found DNA on both of the female deceased victims, which in 1984, the technology obviously wasn't there, so they stored that DNA. The DNA, though, that they found in the Bennett family house matched the DNA that was left on this woman a week before. Patricia Smith was sexually assaulted and murdered in her house, bludgeoned by a hammer. There were other similar attacks in Aurora around the same time. It wouldn't be until over 3 decades later when they finally caught their man. This is Alexander Hammer Killer Ewing. He was served to 40 years in prison for attempted murder back in 1984. In 2017, the DNA left behind from the murders matched him. He was recently convicted of the murders, and he got 3 life sentences. A seemingly kind and loving man would end up committing one of the most vile acts of murder I've ever heard. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case known as the Monster of Worcester. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was the home of the Ralph family, and they lived in Worcester, which is in England. Living here was Clive Ralph, his wife Elsie, and their 2 children, Paul and Dawn Maria. Now, Clive, he had a friend named David McGreevy. He had spent some time in the Royal Navy, but by 1971, he was discharged when he started a fire. He was then forced to move back in with his parents, and then a fiance he had ended up breaking up with him. So his life was really just starting to snowball downwards. By 1972, his parents gave him the boot from the house, and so that's when Clive Ralph offered to let him stay with them. So he moved in 1972, and towards the end of that same year, the couple would have their 3rd child, Samantha. David would end up getting a factory job. It didn't pay him a lot, but it paid him enough that he was able to give the couple some money for rent every week. And he just got along with everyone, including the children. He was super playful with them. He loved being around them. At At one point, they even said he had this, like, father-like approach with the kids. He even scolded the mom one time when she disciplined one of the kids. On April 13th, 1973, he would go out to a bar with a friend, and he would have about 7 or 8 beers. He and the friend he went there with got into a bit of a fight, so Clive would come pick him up. He then brought David back to the home, and then Clive went to go pick up Elsie from work. A couple hours later, when Clive and Elsie got to their home, they noticed there were police cars outside. They were not permitted to go in the house, and they were immediately brought to the police station. The 3 children, who Clive left in the care of David that night while he went to go pick up his wife, they had all been brutally murdered sometime between 10:15 and 11:15 that evening. David was beyond drunk, and when baby Samantha began to cry, he would beat the infant and crushed her skull. He then just went to 2-year-old Dawn's room and slit her throat. He then went to 4-year-old Paul, and he strangled him to death. And he did not stop there. He went and got a pickaxe from their basement. He dismembered the children, and then he impaled all 3 of them on their spiked fence out front. Like, this was a 0 to 100 type thing. Like, Jesus Christ. David was arrested a few hours later, and he eventually confessed to doing it. He blamed the alcohol, of course. He was convicted of the murders, was given 20 years to life, and in 2018, he was paroled. He's now out there free. An innocent-looking moment captured on CCTV footage would turn out to be one of unspeakable horror. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Groene family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. This creeper is Joseph Edward Duncan. In May of 2005, he would skip bail after he was arrested for molesting a young boy. He would rent a 2005 Jeep Cherokee, but he would never return it, so he essentially stole the vehicle. He then just happened to stumble across the Groene family at their Coeur d'Alene, Idaho home. Looking from afar, he became kind of obsessed with the 2 youngest children, Shasta and Dylan. He would spy on the family for a few days. On May 15th, the entire family had drove into town, and when they got back, a nightmare ensued. Joseph Duncan was there. He would tie up the whole family. He took Shasta and Dylan and put them outside, and then, using a hammer, he would bludgeon to death the rest of the family. 40-year-old Brenda Groene, her boyfriend, 37-year-old Mark Mackenzie, and one of Brenda's 3 children, 13-year-old Slade Groene. He then forced the 2 youngest children into his stolen vehicle, and he kidnapped them. The family's bodies would be found the very next day by a neighbor, and then a manhunt began for the missing 2 children, and for the monster who killed the family. He took the 2 children to various locations, but they spent most of their time at a remote campsite with some abandoned building, where he would repeatedly, daily, sexually assault both children. He tortured them. Shasta was 8 years old, Dylan was 9. Right here on this very location, Joseph Duncan claims he was searching through a clear box for something when the shotgun he was holding accidentally went off and it shot Dylan in the stomach. Shasta claims Joseph said it was an accident. She then witnessed him put the shotgun at point-blank range to her brother's forehead and fired. He died instantly. He said it was to put him out of his misery. A couple of days later, he would ask Shasta, "How would you like to die? Strangulation or gunshot?" She said she chose strangulation. He put a rope around her neck and began to string her up, but then she begged for her life, and so he stopped. By the way, this torturing between the 2 kids went on for 7 weeks. The 2 would be caught on CCTV footage after Dylan was killed, walking into a convenience store, seeming like a father and daughter, but we now know that wasn't the case. On July 2nd, 2005, witnesses saw both people at a Denny's. They called 911 and the nightmare was over. They'd find out later he murdered other people. He died in prison this year. This is the case of John List. This is John with his wife Helen, with his 16-year-old daughter Patricia, 15-year-old son John Jr., and 13-year-old Frederick. The family all lived together in their quaint little New Jersey home with John's mother, Alma. In 1971, John had been working for the Jersey City Bank. But when the bank closed, John was too embarrassed to tell his wife. So every day he put on his clothes like he was going to work, and then he would spend the day looking for jobs. Then he would begin to steal small amounts of Alma's money just to help pay the mortgage. But then the financial strain became really thin. This is when he began to encourage his older children to look for work, to teach them, the responsibilities of being an adult, while still keeping his loss of job a secret. John was also dealing with the stress of the fact that his wife was an alcoholic and that she was suffering from untreated syphilis. When the financial situation became just too much to handle, he thought he only had one of two options: welfare or murder his entire family. And he considered welfare to be the unacceptable option, thinking it would expose him and his family to ridicule and it would embarrass his father. On November 9th, 1971, while all of the kids were at school, using his 1912 9mm automatic handgun and his father's .22 caliber revolver, he shot his wife Helen in the back of the head. And then he shot his 84-year-old mother above the left eye. And then 16-year-old Patricia and 13-year-old Frederick walked in the house after school, and while he was hiding, he shot them both in the back of the head. He then went to 15-year-old son John Jr.'s school to watch him play a game of soccer. Then John brought him home and shot him multiple times. The reason that John Sr. had to shoot John Jr. multiple times was because his gun misfired, and John Jr. tried to fight back. So John Jr. was allegedly the only one to know that it was his father doing all of this. John List would then write letters, fake letters, to various people in an attempt to explain why they hadn't been seen in a while. So it wasn't until December 7th that the bodies were found in the home. This became the most notorious crime story in New Jersey since the Lindbergh baby disappeared. And by the way, the home was destroyed by fire in 1972, about 9 months after the mass murder. It was determined to be arson, but no suspects were ever found or caught. It likely wasn't John List who burned the house down, because right after the murders he took off. And a new home was built over the location in 1974. So, this will be the end of part 1, so please look for part 2, which I will upload right away, where I give you the explanation of how John List was caught. Alright, this is part 2 of the John List story, how he was finally captured. So, right after he murdered his entire family in New Jersey, he boarded a train from Jersey to Michigan, then Michigan to Colorado. He decided to settle down in Denver. He stole the name of an old college classmate of his, Robert Peter Clark, and he got himself a nice little accounting job. How nice! He then remarried. He got himself a lucky lady, Dolores Miller, 1985. They then moved to Midlothian, Virginia. In 1989, the story of the List family murders was shown on America's Most Wanted. It was during the show's very first season. A forensic artist named Frank Bender made a bust of what John List would likely look like today, or in 1989. And he was recognized. Check this shit out. How good is that? Like, this is crazy to me. He got the hairline down. He even picked out the right fucking glasses. So, on April 12th, 1990, the 64-year-old man was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was to serve all 5 life sentences consecutively. Good luck outliving that one, bud. At his sentencing hearing, he would deny any direct responsibility for the murders, blaming it on his mental state at the time, saying that, he should be unaccountable for the shit he did. And the judge, the compassionate man that he was like, okay, oh my god, you know what, get the fuck out of here. 5 life sentences, you dumb prick. I might be paraphrasing, or lying, I'm not sure. The judge didn't buy it. The story was turned into a TV movie called Judgment Day, the John List story. It also inspired the movie The Stepfather. It was featured on Forensic Files. He even did an interview with Connie Chung in 2002. But on March 21st, 2008, at the young age of 82, John List died of pneumonia. Peace! A family murdered, a shootout with police, and a wrongful conviction. This one's got a lot. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Harris family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Just days before Christmas, in the early morning hours of December 23rd, 1989, police would be called to the Harris home because the fire alarm had been going off. It was the Dryden, New York house that belonged to Tony and Dolores Harris and their 2 children, Shelby and Mark. They were a very outgoing, just positive, uplifting family, and it's said that they would open their door to literally anyone. When police arrived that December 23rd morning, they would uncover the bodies of every single family member. Each member had a pillowcase over their head, and they were shot through the head. They had also been set on fire. Police noticed the phone lines were cut, but there was no sign of forced entry. Outside the home, they found 1 set of tire tracks, and the family's van was missing. They also found a gas can there, but police had very little to go on evidence-wise. That is until they realized that Tony and Dolores' credit cards were being used. Police would discover that they were actually being utilized by this man, Michael Kinge, and his mother, Shirley Kinge. Police would go to Michael's apartment, which is actually right next door to his mother's apartment. They lived in 2 separate places. They confronted him, they wanted to talk to him, but that wouldn't get to happen. Michael pulled out a gun and began firing at the cops. So a shootout ensued, and Michael would be shot dead. They retrieved several gasoline cans from his apartment. Now, they also pulled fingerprints off of the can that was left at the Harris home. Shirley Kinge would be arrested for credit card theft, and because her fingerprint allegedly was on the gas can at the Harris home, she was also charged with arson and hindering a prosecution and also burglary charges. She was convicted and got an 18 to 47 year sentence. Shirley openly admitted to using the credit cards. There was no dispute about that. And this was in 1990, by the way. In 1992, a criminal investigation was opened against one of the deputies, whose name was David Harding. He was the one to find her fingerprint on the gas can. Turns out, he planted it. He planted Shirley's fingerprint on the gas can to incriminate her for arson. Because someone had to be punished, right? Michael was dead. Shirley was released in 1992. This is her in the year 2000. She was awarded $286,000 after serving 2 years in jail. She died in 2015. And Officer Harding admitted to even more planted evidence in other cases. He got 4.5 years jail time. At least he paid a little bit. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the RJR Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. RJR is a property management company in Mandan, North Dakota. And on the afternoon of April 1st, 2019, something horrible would be discovered inside. 4 employees had been shot and stabbed to death. Between the 4 of them, there was about 100 stab wounds and roughly 8 gunshots. The victims were Robert Faulkner, William Cobb, Lois Cobb, and Adam Fuhrer. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, nothing was ransacked. These were just 4 people who went into work that morning and wound up dead for it. Police went through their CCTV footage of the building. They were able to see when William and Lois Cobb walked in, and then they were able to see when Robert Faulkner and also Adam Fuhrer, they were able to see when they all walked in. Within a few minutes, they would all be dead. Because this, an unknown man at the time, he walked in after all of them. Disguised in a thick orange jacket, he's wearing an orange ski mask. Then you have footage of that man walking in the building. And this is honestly kind of a terrifying image, because this man is the murderer. And the 4 people he killed, they're just somewhere right around the corner. Shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, the man in the orange disguise walks out and actually takes off with this truck. At some point, the man changed into darker clothing, that's him right there, and then he abandoned the vehicle just a couple minutes later. Police were then able to follow the man walking on CCTV to a McDonald's parking lot nearby, where he got into this white pickup truck. I swear to God, CCTV is freaking amazing. They were able to determine who belonged to this truck, and it was this man, 46-year-old Chad Isaac. Chad was actually a chiropractor. He also lived in a mobile home, and that mobile home was on the property owned by RJR. Because of the truck, police got a warrant to search his place. Lo and behold, they found the same orange jacket in a washing machine. They found gun parts in his freezer. They also found the knife in his home. They had bullet fragments that matched the ones that were used to shoot the 4 individuals. Chad, of course, he denied all of it, but the physical evidence was unbelievably overwhelming. One problem, and I know what you're going to ask. Why? Why did he go in there and gun down 4 people? The answer? Unknown. Literally no one has established a motive. Could it be something to do with rent on his property? Maybe. But police have not been able to link anything concrete for motive, but they don't have to prove a motive in this case. Chad Isaak would be found guilty of the 4 murders, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A reggae artist on the heels of Bob Marley would be gunned down in his own home. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Peter Tosh. Viewer discretion is advised. Peter Tosh, who was born as Winston McIntosh, was born in 1944 in Jamaica. At a very young age, his parents would just no longer be in his life. Pretty early on in his life, he just fended for himself, and he would pick up a love for music by the early 60s. He taught himself how to play guitar by watching another person play guitar and memorized the finger movements. By the mid-60s, he's actually working alongside Bob Marley. They had a group formed called the Wailing Wailers. He began a solo career in 1977, and that was going very successfully. By 1987, he was living in the beautiful Kingston, Jamaica, and life was just going really well. That is until the night of September 11th, 1987, at his home in Jamaica. In the house that night was Peter Tosh, Jeff Dixon, who went by Free Eye, Carlton Santa Davis, and I don't have pictures of the rest, but also there was Wilton Doc Brown, Peter's common-law wife Marlene Brown, Free Eye's wife Joy Dixon, and Michael Robinson. That evening, a man by the name of Dennis Lepo Loban, along with 2 other men, would enter the home of Peter Tosh. Allegedly, they were there hanging out for a little bit, and then things went crazy. Dennis and his accomplice pulled out guns and began to demand money from Peter Tosh and his friends. And then the gunshots rang out. All 7 people in the home that night had been shot. 4 of them managed to survive. 3 of them would meet their untimely end. The lives ended that night would be Jeff Free Eye Dixon, Wilton Doc Brown, and Peter Tosh. When the dust had settled, the 3 assailants had took off, leaving carnage in their wake. A few days later, Dennis Loban would turn himself in, allegedly. And by the way, this is the only picture of him I could find, sorry. So why did he do it? Well, no one really knows. There's only rumors. The biggest rumor being that when Dennis Loban went to prison earlier in his life, it was because he was taking the rap for something Peter Tosh allegedly did. Dennis asked Peter to take care of his kids. When he got out of prison, he noticed Peter Tosh had this thriving music career, and his kids were left in the wind. So this was possibly a revenge story. But again, it's never been confirmed. Dennis Loban was convicted of the murders, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Christopher Churchill. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to the little village of Noble, Illinois, a town that does not see much violence and does not see much crime. But on February 11th, 1998, it saw a whole lot of it. In this home lived 32-year-old Debbie Smith, her boyfriend 17-year-old Jonathan Lloyd, and also Debbie's 3 kids, 12-year-old Kenny, 7-year-old Jennifer, and 5-year-old Corey. And also living with them was Jonathan's half-brother, 16-year-old Christopher Churchill. Unfortunately, his is the only picture I can find. I have been looking forever and I cannot find any confirmed pictures of any of the other 5 people. Police would be called to the house sometime in the evening of February 11, 1998. And when they got inside, they found the bodies of 5 people. Everyone but Christopher was dead. And Christopher was nowhere. All 5 people, yes, including the young children, had been bludgeoned to death by a hammer. The hammer was found behind the couch. The police essentially had one suspect, Christopher Churchill. 6 days after the murders, he was found and he was arrested. While under interrogation, he confessed. He said he and the family were playing cards, they were drinking, they were seemingly having a fun time. But Christopher felt like he got teased a lot, and this angered him. He would say he had a lot of pent-up aggression. He also had fantasies, and these fantasies were about killing his family. He would go on to say that the murders were committed because he wanted to relieve some stress. Sometimes a stress ball will do the trick. Maybe go play a video game, I don't know. Maybe, go to the batting cages. Maybe take some medication, seek therapy. Many choices before what you did. He didn't just stop at the murders. He sexually assaulted 12-year-old Jennifer as she was dying. And then he did the same thing to 6-year-old Kenny. Police asked him why he did that. He said, and I quote, "I felt like being sick." End quote. They backed up his story by finding a blood-spattered shirt that he wore during the killings. The blood matched the victims, and it was consistent with, a cast-off type stain. On May 3rd, 1999, he was found guilty of all of the murders and also the sexual assaults, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was the aftermath of his first attack, but he was far from being done. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the monster known as Anders Behring Breivik. Viewer discretion is strongly advised, and a trigger warning because this one does talk about a mass shooting. Anders here is from Oslo, Norway. He is, as most people describe him, a far-right Christian extremist. And he had a major disdain for the Muslim community. In fact, he wrote a manifesto called 2083, a European Declaration of Independence. Here he targets Muslim immigration and European liberalism. In 2002, he would begin plans to fund an attack. He would work odd jobs, and then he opened up some of his own small companies. Eventually, he got to a point when he had enough money, and then he got himself a farm, because that was an easy way to get fertilizer in truckloads, especially without anyone giving him a second look. On July 22nd, 2011, at approximately 3:26 p.m., you can see Anders walking away from this white van. It's parked underneath a building. In that building was the Prime Minister of Norway at the time, Jens Stoltenberg. The van contained a fertilizer bomb. As security goes to inspect the van, the bomb detonates. The explosion would rip through the building, and it would create this damage. The explosion killed 8 people. The Prime Minister was not one of the victims. This is an image of Anders dressed head to toe in gear, walking away from the explosion. And he had one more trip. While they were trying to rescue people from the building, Anders would travel to Utoya Island. He took a ferry there, and it was about a 20-mile trip. This is him recreating the events of Utoya Island with police, because on July 22nd, 2011, he was dressed head to toe in his police gear. He had these fake credentials on him. There was a Labour Party youth group there on the island that day, and he opened fire on them. And these were kids aged 13 to 22, and he just ripped through all of them. 319 people had non-fatal injuries, but 69 people were shot and killed on the island. So he killed 77 people that day. He was arrested without issue. He smiled through court. They don't have the death penalty there. So he was sentenced to life without parole. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the El Paso Walmart Massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of August 3rd, 2019, at approximately 10:40 in the morning, the store manager of this particular Walmart noticed a man holding a gun and firing at people in the parking lot. The manager would quickly run back into the store and issue a code brown, which is the code they designated for an active shooter. This El Paso, Texas Walmart was extremely packed that morning. This is CCTV footage of the gunman walking into the store Yes, I blurred out the weapons because you get in trouble for that. And 911 was also called very promptly, and they got there on the scene about 6 minutes later. The FBI and ATF also got there pretty quickly as well. But the gunman was inside, and he was firing. He was using a WASR-10 rifle. I guess that's considered a semi-automatic rifle. I don't know guns. But in the time between 911 being called and all of the authorities getting there, as well as initially when they got there, this shooter managed to shoot and kill 23 people. And he injured over 20 more. It was chaos inside, it was chaos outside. People had been recording footage from inside the Walmart. I guess I wouldn't personally think to take out my phone and start recording, but that's just me. But there is haunting video of people running and screaming, people hiding under benches. The shooter managed to flee, where he got in his car and drove about a mile away from the Walmart. But the Texas Rangers were able to stop him at an intersection where he got out of his car and he said, "I'm the shooter." So who is this piece of shit? Another white fucking nerd, of course. 21-year-old Patrick Crusius. Police discovered that he was able to purchase the gun legally. In his interrogation, he said he specifically targeted Mexicans. God, I fucking hate living here sometimes. He posted a manifesto. He called it The Inconvenient Truth. He said he was inspired by the Christchurch Mosque shooting in New Zealand, a horrific event where 51 people died. I'll cover this one, or maybe Jared can later. The manifesto supports white nationalism and a far-right conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement. He would use phrases that Donald Trump also used, like invasion. He also said in his manifest to not blame Trump, which why would we? You did this. This was a hate crime. And these were his victims. I don't have enough time to say all their names, but his main targets were Hispanic. Due to COVID, the trial's been pushed back. They want the death penalty. A bus full of hostages would end in bloodshed. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case known as the Manila hostage crisis. Viewer discretion is advised. This was former Philippine National Police Force patrolman Rolando Mendoza. At one point during his career, he was considered one of the top 10 Philippine police officers. But in 2008, he was dismissed from the police force. This was because Mendoza and 4 other officers were accused of accosting a pedestrian during a traffic violation. He was even accused of planting meth on that pedestrian and forced that person to take those drugs. But then all of that was overturned when the so-called victim failed to show up to any court hearings. But then in 2009, Mendoza was accused of extortion. And once again, he was dismissed from duty, permanently this time, and they also got rid of all of his benefits. Rolando was very angry because he was never even given a chance to defend himself. He never got a hearing. On the morning of August 23rd, 2010, Rolando Mendoza would board a tour bus. And this was a Hong Thai tour bus. Now, he boarded the bus near Rizal Park, which is in Manila in the Philippines. He didn't pay to get on the bus. Instead, he showed the bus driver he had a weapon on him. He then handcuffed the bus driver to the wheel, and then he officially hijacked the bus. On his person, a handgun and an M16 rifle. And there were 25 other people on the bus. Only 4 of them were locals. The other 21 were Hong Kong tourists. What was his end game? Well, he said he was framed for the extortion. And he demanded that he be given his job back and his benefits, and no one will die. About 90 minutes in, he released a few hostages, including the children on board. And then 2 Philippines from the outside volunteered to become hostages in order to free them. And then later, the hostages who volunteered were then released by Rolando. And then his brother, Gregorio Mendoza, he showed up. He tried to negotiate with Rolando without the police's permission. The police then quickly took him and arrested him. And that was the last straw for Rolando. After witnessing his brother get arrested, at 7:21 p.m. he began to shoot hostages. The police charged in, they surrounded the bus. Rolando is still shooting people inside. Husbands sacrificed themselves to save their wives. A young girl sacrificed herself to save her brother. He started shooting people point blank in the head. 8 hostages were killed and 9 were wounded. A sniper was perched nearby. When Rolando stepped out, he was shot in the head and killed. This is the haunting image of smoke billowing from a sniper rifle during an event that is considered to be the first school shooting in U.S. history, and committed by the unlikeliest of people. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Charles Whitman. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles was born in 1941 in Lake Worth, Florida. His family life and upbringing honestly was rather normal for those times. His father was very controlling, very demanding, very strict, and yes, the father would physically abuse them from time to time. It never seemed to faze Charles, though, or his brothers, really. He was considered to be a super polite, respectful, just great kid. He even had an IQ of 139 by age 6. He grew up in the Roman Catholic Church with his mom and his brothers. He worked throughout his high school days, saved up his own money to buy his own stuff. He was an exemplary high school student. He graduated 7th in his class. He was popular. He was well loved. After high school, he secretly enlisted in the military. He didn't tell his father. And when his father found out, he wasn't too pleased. However, Papa could be proud of him for something. His father did teach him how to shoot as he was growing up, and Charles would become one of the top sharpshooters. He was awarded a sharpshooter's badge. He received high marks for being able to shoot moving targets. By 1962, he was in college, and he married the love of his life. They had a wonderful marriage. He adored his wife. She adored him. Everything in his life was just going great. He did attend the University of Texas at Austin. His grades were good, but they were kind of slipping a little bit. Nothing astronomical. He had begun to experience headaches, mood issues, some anger issues. Then his parents got divorced. Charles helped his mom move to Texas. And then, out of nowhere, Charles drove to his mother's house in Texas. He then stabbed her in the chest while she slept. He then drove back to his home where his wife was asleep, and he stabbed her in the heart while she slept. He then entered the main building of his school, shot and killed 3 people, climbed to the 28th floor near the clock, armed with a sniper rifle, and he began firing. For 96 minutes, he opened fire on innocent people below. He killed 14 people that day, and he wounded 31 others before he was fatally shot by the police. At his autopsy, they found he had a tumor. It may have possibly influenced his actions, but that's never been concluded. It's still a mystery. 4 people would be murdered over some coins. Yeah. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Toowoomba Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Carl Bachmann and his wife, Gloria Bachmann, they owned a little coin shop, and this was inside of like an apartment building, but it was also at the same time a nursery. From what I understand, the coin shop was in like the basement level of this building, which by the way now is just private housing. Now this is located in Rome, New York. Rome, New York. I did not know that was a place. On November 16th, 1979, police would be called to this building because there were reports of a quadruple homicide. When police arrived, that is exactly what they found. Gloria Bachmann, Carl Bachmann, Gloria's mother, Rose Dunn, and a friend of the family, Bruce Barber. All 4 had been lined up in the back room of the building. They were all lying face down, and they had all been shot execution style. When police arrived, they weren't sure if the shooters were still in the building, so they had to secure the scene, but thankfully there was no one there to, fire at them. The killers were long gone. The motive was obvious, and that was theft. They stole over $100,000 worth of coins. And these are like rare coins, by the way, in case you didn't know what coin shops sold. But it wasn't just rare coins from the US. This shop also had rare, very rare, African gold Krugerrands. Police believe that these were the main target. Unfortunately, at the crime scene, there was very little evidence. And this is 1979, so they didn't really know what DNA was. But also, there was no fingerprints. There was no fibers. There were witnesses who said they saw a Volkswagen Bug drive away from the building. They also heard from a convenience store clerk who probably sold the duct tape that the killers used to them earlier that day. Carl Bachmann's wallet would be found a month later in the Potomac River, but it really left no actual physical evidence behind. In 1980, a man by the name of William Mooney, who is now living in Kenosha, Wisconsin, he was arrested for a robbery, and he said he had inside information on a quadruple homicide from New York. You see, he had multiple sclerosis at the time, and he thought he was going to die from it. Nope. So he would come clean about what happened, and he ratted out his 2 cohorts, and their names were Edward Perry and William Hanna, and they had fled to Florida, where police were able to track them down, and they were all charged with murder. Sorry, I have no pictures of them, but they all got 100-year sentences. The ironic part, the guy who thought he was dying, he's the only one still alive in prison. Hello, true crimerers. How do you like my new glasses? Oh, Jesus Christ! This is the case of this fucking creep, Bruce George Peter Lee. This guy took every fucking first name there is. Who the fuck? Sorry. He was born Peter George Dinsdale, but would later change his name to that obnoxious shit. And this fella originally is from Manchester, England. Just stop with the accents. He was basically raised through a series of different children's homes, because his parents weren't exactly great. He had issues with epilepsy and he walked with a permanent limp. December 4th, 1979. This was the house of the Hasties, and it was in East Riding of Yorkshire. Well, a fire would sweep through the home. Unfortunately, asleep in the home at the time was Mother Edith and her 4 boys, Thomas and Charles, who were both aged 15, 12-year-old son Paul, and 8-year-old son Peter. Edith also had 3 girls, but they were not in the house that night. They were staying over at a relative's house. Her husband, Tommy, was in jail. Edith and Thomas were the only 2 people to survive. Police would discover that the Hasties were kind of an issue family. They dove into crime quite often. So the speculation was someone probably started this fire out of vengeance. And they would be right. 6 months into the investigation, Bruce George Peter Lee, Liam Noah Oliver Elijah William James Benjamin Lucas Henry Michael Alex Mason Jones the 14th Applesauce the 9th, or some shit, while being questioned by police, which he volunteered to be questioned, he had affiliations with some of the family members. Well, he would confess. He said, yeah, no, I started it. He basically poured kerosene into their mailbox and lit it afire. Why did he do it? Revenge against Charles Hasty, who this guy, who was over the age of 18, had a sexual relationship with Charles, a minor. Charles threatened to expose him, so he reacted. He was also in love with one of the daughters, Angelina, but she rejected him. But guess what? He then confessed to more arsons. 11 of them. Police had him show all of the homes, and he was spot on. They were all burned down. They then took him to a home where they know for a fact someone else committed the arson, and he said, yeah, that wasn't me, I didn't do that. So they knew he was telling the truth. He said he did it on purpose because he liked fire. And throughout all of these fires, 26 people died, including a newborn baby. But the Hasties were the only ones he knew, the only one he committed out of revenge. So he was sentenced to life in prison. 11 of his manslaughter convictions would be overturned later because evidence shows he didn't do them. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Lake Waco murders. Viewer discretion is advised. In the early evening hours of July 14th, 1982, police officers in Waco, Texas would be called to Spiegelville Park, which is located near Lake Waco. Earlier that same day, an 18-year-old boy by the name of Kenneth Franks was reported missing. He had last been seen with 17-year-old Raylene Rice and Jill Montgomery. They, too, appeared to be missing. That brief mystery would be solved when the officers got to Spiegelville Park. They uncovered the body of Kenneth Franks. And then 75 yards away from his body were the remains of Jill Montgomery and Raylene Rice. All 3 victims had been stabbed to death. The crime scene gave them very little. No evidence left behind, no murder weapon. The owner of a local gas station, whose name was Munir Deeb, he allegedly had some issues with Kenneth Franks. The two were seen having verbal spats. And then 2 women came forward to say that he actually confessed to the murders of the 3 teens. He was given a polygraph test and he passed. And because they had no physical evidence, they let him go. So apparently, police discovered that Deeb had an employee at his gas station who he took out a life insurance policy on, and he orchestrated this plot to have her killed to redeem the money. So they theorized that he then hired this man, David Wayne Spence, to pull off this murder. And then I guess David, with the help of the Melendez brothers, Anthony and Gilbert, well, they believe they found the person they were supposed to kill. But then they apparently mistook the person they were supposed to get for Jill Montgomery. So I guess they killed her, so Raylene and Kenneth had to die as well because they were witnesses. The Melendez brothers would go on to confess, which then sealed the deal, of course, for David Spence. The only other evidence the police had was jailhouse snitch confessions and the shaky testimony of some people who claim they were told about the murders. The girls had bite marks on their bodies, supposedly. And supposedly it matched David Spence. But in actuality, the bite marks weren't even conclusive. Certain experts couldn't even determine that they were actual teeth. But Deeb, the Melendez brothers, and David Spence were all convicted. Spence was sentenced to death. He would actually be executed. Deeb was also sentenced to death, but he eventually won an appeal, and he had his conviction thrown out. The Melendez brothers were sentenced to life in prison because they confessed. By now, all 4 men are dead, and it's possible none of them did this. There's evidence to show the confessions were coerced. A more viable suspect, Terry Harper, he lied about his alibi, and he also confessed to people about doing it. He was even seen in the park that night, and he loved knives. But police believed his alibi. But now it's just too late. A horrific quadruple homicide would occur after a teenage girl met a stranger online. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Farmville Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. This was 16-year-old Emma Niederbrock of Farmville, Virginia. And Farmville is a little outside of Richmond. In her teenage years, Emma became a fan of something called horrorcore. I had honestly never heard of it before, but it's like a very dark genre of like rap, hip-hop, and the themes of like the songs are based on like horror movies and murders, but the music in itself is harmless. It's just another genre of music. And this is Emma pictured with her friend Melanie, and this is the 2 of them pictured with a friend and horrorcore artist named Razakel. This fella is Richard McCroskey, otherwise known online as Psycho Sam. Your hair is very moist, sir, and that's very much bothering me. He also went by Lil Demon Dog. Oh, Jesus Christ. He was a horrorcore fan, and he lived in Castro Valley, California. Now, he would end up meeting Emma online on a horrorcore MySpace page. Wow, MySpace. But anyway, they developed a relationship. Now, Emma's parents, pictured here, they had been divorced for about 9 months around the time of the story beginning. 50-year-old Mark Niederbrock was a pastor. 53-year-old Deborah Kelly was a criminal justice professor. Cool. Even though they were divorced and they lived separately, they were both very much involved in their daughter's life, of course. Now, they, along with Melanie Wells' parents, and Melanie was 18 years old, by the way, they were all very accepting and relatively okay with their love of this particular genre of music. In September of 2009, the girls wanted to go to a horrorcore concert. All of the parents agreed, and Emma wanted her online boyfriend to go with them. The parents agreed to do so as long as they accompanied them on the trip. Emma and Mr. Psycho, I presume, they had a bit of a fight at the concert. Richard had become increasingly unhappy with their relationship, and after the concert, awkwardly, he was to be spending about 2 weeks at Emma's house. Well, a couple days after they got home from the concert, no one had heard from any of them. Melanie, by the way, was also staying with the family for about a week or so. Her family hadn't heard anything from her, so they got worried. Now, Mark didn't live there, so he did not know they were missing. So Melanie's mom calls him and says, "Hey, can you go check on them at the house?" So he does, and then he is never heard from again. So police are called, and when they get inside the home, the 3 women and Mark were all bludgeoned to death. The girls had already been dead a few days before Mark went over, and he was greeted by Richard, and then he was killed. Richard was then caught sleeping at an airport, where he was arrested. He pleaded guilty and got life without parole. What if the strangers happened in real life, huh? What if? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Robinson family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. The Robinson family was from Detroit, Michigan, and it consisted of 42-year-old Richard, 40-year-old wife Shirley, and their 4 children. 19-year-old Richard, 16-year-old Gary, 12-year-old Randall, and 7-year-old Susan. In June of 1968, they decided to vacation at their cabin, which was located in Goodhart, Michigan. Now, Richard, he went by Dick, Teehee. He owned an advertising company. That'll come into play later. After June 25th, 1968, no one seemed to hear from the Robinson family anymore. There was a hastily written note on their door that said, "Be back by 7:10, Robinson." So people assumed they left and would come back. But when the smell started, that's when people grew concerned. And the smell was reportedly horrendous. It permeated all throughout the nearby neighborhood. So a caretaker would go to the house on July 22nd. The doors were locked, but something about that smell made him have to know what's going on. So he pried the door open, and when he opened the door all the way, he saw 40-year-old Shirley Robinson bloodied and covered with a blanket. I'm going to blur out her face and whatnot. So the police were called. Shirley was shot once in the head with a .25 caliber bullet. In the hallway was 42-year-old Richard. He was shot once in the head with a .25 caliber. He was also struck with a hammer. They also found the bodies of the 4 children. All of them shot to death at least once, and some of them were also beat with a claw hammer. Like I said earlier, Shirley was covered with a blanket, and one of them had like a rug sort of covering them. The killer left behind the bloody claw hammer, but they did not leave behind any of the guns that were used. Police believe that the shooting started from outside, where they believe that Dick was shot first. And then the evidence shows that the rest of the family was literally hunted down in the house, chased, beaten over the head with a hammer, and then shot. The investigation found one genuine suspect. And this is where I go back to the advertising company. Dick Robinson, second in command at the advertising company, Joseph Scolaro. You see, in the months previous, he had embezzled about $60,000 from the company. He was giving people raises without Dick's permission, and he got caught. He had also recently purchased a .25 caliber gun. By 1972, they finally had enough to put charges on him. He must have caught wind because that same day he ended his own life. So technically this case is unresolved.